Welcome back, everyone. In this section, we're going to be talking about body cavities. Now, body cavities have an essential function for us. They are going to protect organs from accidental shocks and injury. And they permit change in the size and shape of some of the internal organs. They give a little bit of leeway. So we're going to talk about some of these cavities. I want you to pay attention to the diaphragm, which is really important. We're going to focus on the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and a few others. So right here, we're looking at a lateral view. This is the person from the side. This is anterior. This is posterior. Remember, this is superior, and as we go down, inferior if we're going down to the feet, or we can say caudal, we could say cephalic and caudal because it's to the tail, cephalic and caudal. Okay, over here we saw this key being divided by the diaphragm. Let's go here. Here's the diaphragm. Diaphragm is a muscle that will separate these two cavities from one another. It's separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So we have these two main cavities. Now, the thoracic cavity has an A and a B, right? It's got these two little subcategories. You have a pleural cavity, which is surrounding the lungs, with pericardial, cardial for heart, surrounding the heart. Then we have an abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, we're going to talk about the abdominal cavity, and then we'll talk a little bit about the pelvic cavity. So we also have the brain, which sits in the cranial cavity. And then we have the spinal cord that sits in the posterior cavity. The brain is in the cranial cavity. And then we have this spinal cord that's in the spinal cavity. This is on the posterior side, whereas this portion is on the anterior side. Again, we're looking at a lateral view. So this is pleural for lungs. This separation is where your diaphragm is. And then the purple region, this would be the abdominal pelvic region. Okay, so here was a drag and drop. Remember here I said the brain and the spinal cord is on the posterior side. This is the anterior side. So in this drag and drop, they call it a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. So they want you to know, what do you have back here on the posterior side or dorsal side? And then what do you have here in the front on the ventral side? So on the dorsal side, we had the brain sitting in the cranial cavity, the spinal cord in the vertebral canal, right? The spinal cord sits in that vertebral canal. And what surrounds your spinal cord are the meninges. You've heard of meningitis. In the front, in the ventral cavity, we had the abdominal cavity. You had your diaphragm. We had the lungs and another structure that I didn't discuss yet. It's called the mediastinum. The mediastinum is a region in which all the structures pass that lead into the heart. It's between the lungs that lead into the heart. That's the mediastinum. It sounds like in the middle of the sternum, mediastinum. Now, when we talk about these cavities, we're going to be focusing on the heart and the lungs and the digestive organs. The heart is encased by some soft tissue structures. And we can see that there is let me change the color here. Let's change it to change it to black. So here we have a layer that comes into contact with the viscera or with the organ, and then there's a side here that does not come into contact. It's the outer portion. Look at the fist going into a balloon. If you push your fist into a balloon, there's one layer that makes contact with your fist, and then there's another layer that's outside of it, and then in the middle is going to be this cavity. All right, so that's kind of easy to see when we look at the fist going into the balloon, right? A lot easier to see. So the heart, let's say the fist would be the heart. The layer that comes into contact with the fist, the layer that comes into contact with the heart is called the viscera. So it's called the visceral pericardium. Cardium is heart, peri means around. Visceral pericardium. The layer that's on the outer portion is called the parietal pericardium. So we're going to see these two words, visceral and parietal, whether we are talking about the heart, the lungs, or the digestive organs. Okay, we will just change the name from visceral pericardium to visceral pleura, from parietal pericardium to parietal pleura, if we're talking about the lungs, because pleura is lungs. All right, let's take a look here. So the visceral layer covers the organ, and the parietal layer is on the outside. It's going to line the cavity. So now in this picture, we see both the lungs and the heart. And we see that whenever we're looking at the lungs, we use the word pleura. And whenever we talk about the heart, we see pericardium. So now the only thing we have to figure out is which is the visceral layer and which is the parietal layer. The visceral layer is closer to the viscera, which is the organ. The parietal layer is closer to the outside. So let's look at the heart first. This layer here is closest to the organ, so that's the visceral pericardium. This layer here is outside, it's the parietal, and then between the two is the cavity, the parietal cavity. Apply the same concept to the lungs. The innermost part of the lung is the visceral pleura. The outermost portion is the parietal pleura, and the cavity in between both of those is the pleural cavity. So what is this purple or blue layer, right? So you have the blue layer, then you're going to have a black layer, and then you have the cavity in between. So this one is pointing to the visceral pericardium. If it was the black layer, it would be the parietal pericardium. Okay, now we're going to look at the abdominal pelvic cavity. And when we talk about the abdominal pelvic, we're going to hear the term peritoneum, the word peritoneum, but again, visceral or parietal peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum is going to cover the organs of the GI tract, and the parietal is going to line the internal body wall. It's going to be closer to the outside. So here's a lateral view. We see the liver, we see part of the stomach, we see the large intestine. So this blue line, all of this is kind of surrounding, it's not surrounding the organ itself, so it can't be visceral. So we have to find something with the term parietal. Well, we see parietal here and we see parietal here. Two distractors. And now you got to figure out, and you have to know that pleura refers to the lungs, whereas peritoneum refers to the digestive organs in the abdominal pelvic. Okay. We also see peritoneum down here, but this is visceral. If it was this, let me outline this liver. If it was that, then it would be the visceral peritoneum. Because it's the outer portion that lines the walls of it, Now we're looking at parietal peritoneum. Okay.